Hi guys, welcome back to 11th video tutorial of J2EE. The previous discussion we have very much introduction to JDBC and how actually the JDBC architecture will look like. And now we can see the JDBC driver part and what all different drivers are available in market and which one we have to choose for our programming and which is better actually. We can see it and by one so that we can decide which one is the better one out of all. Let me clear this one. So our discussion is about JDBC driver. So in market or in industry, there are four types of JDBC drivers are available. One is JDBC, ODBC, bridge driver. Second one is native API driver. Third one is network protocol driver. Fourth one is thin driver. So these are all the four different drivers we have in the industry, and we can see one by one, and so that we can understand what is the benefits of each driver and what is the drawbacks of each driver. So that we can decide which one is better for compared to all of them. Let's go and discuss about JDBC, ODBC, bridge driver. So the JDBC ODBC bridge driver is used to ODBC driver to connect any database. So this actually the JDBC ODBC bridge driver converts JDBC method calls into ODBC function calls. The diagram will we can see it in practical so that we can understand better. Here the JDBC calls, what are the method calls you will be doing that actually converted into ODBC function calls. So what is ODBC? The ODBC is a Microsoft DLL file which actually used to convert the JDBC operations into the database calls. We can see it in now how it actually looks like. Suppose as we know, so these are Java application. So the JDBC API will sits on top the jar file, which actually used to import the all the classes in a Java application. There's no difference between here, and we have database layer. So there's no difference between these parts. So one is Java application, which actually used for imports JDBC jar, and then it's actually able to use JDBC classes. Now we have JDBC ODBC bridge driver over here. In JDBC ODBC bridge driver, how actually looks like. It contains two parts, I can say. So the JDBC ODBC driver contains two parts. One is JDBC ODBC bridge driver. The other one will be ODBC driver. So this actually contains two parts. One is JDBC ODBC bridge driver. The other one will be ODBC driver. Also, along with these things, we need to have one more library which is belongs to database, which called as vendor database library. So these depends on the vendor database library is depends on the database. Suppose if this is a MySQL database, then the vendor database library will be MySQL library. So whenever MySQL is developing a database, along with that, it actually develops a vendor database library, which is MySQL database library for you, and it will actually give it to the programmers. For each different languages, it actually develops a library. So for separate, for suppose if Java, it is developing Java vendor database library, or for .NET, it actually develops .NET related library. So these libraries coming from database guys, and this is actually a driver which actually used to communicate to a database. Before that, it should talk to database library. Database library will talk to database. So this JDBC ODBC driver is actually used in Windows machine. Suppose if you are in Windows machine, then you should create a JDBC ODBC bridge driver first. Then you have to configure ODBC driver now. And these actually very older versions of JDBC libraries they used to use. And now this is not much. I think I can say 100% no one is using this particular driver because it's having lots of dependencies. So now we can see what is the major benefits and what is the disadvantages with this driver particularly. The advantages will be the configuration and the maintenance will be very much easy. Easy to use and easy to connect DB. So it actually easy to use means the libraries, what are the libraries it is providing, it actually easy to use it, and for connection also it will be pretty much fast and it will be very much easy and it is very flexible to use it. I used to code when my career starting days, and so it will be very much easy. You have to create a DSN for that, and then you have to use that DSN within your Java code. With the DSN, you can able to communicate with the database. So the DSN is a database source name, and which actually used for communicating with the Java application to database. And the drawbacks will be why this is not so popular. So disadvantages will be performance wise, slow. So compared to the other drivers, whatever we have, the other drivers, right? The rest of three drivers. So this will actually performs very slow. The communication between database and the Java application, the time it is taking to communicate is actually very slow. The the steps to involve to installation and setup is very much easy, but performance wise, if you compare with the other three types of databases, this is actually performs very low. And the other disadvantages, which is very major disadvantage, will be client needs to be install this software in his machine. So in client, suppose if so these are data Java application which we deliver to Java to a client. So he has to install this particular JDBC driver. So along with the Java code, the client has to install all these things. He has to install all the software. Suppose not only the application, he has to install the JDBC ODBC driver and vendor library, and all these things he has to install. Then only he can able to communicate with the particular database. Even the database, we can give it in anywhere in the network, and so but these softwares needs to be installed in the client machine. That is a major disadvantage with JDBC ODBC driver. That is the reason a client, none of the clients will actually prefer to install all these softwares along with the projects. So then we can see the other type. What other type of driver is actually providing benefits compared to this particular database driver. The next type will be native API driver. Let me clear this. So the next driver type will be native API driver. So the native API driver, I can say this is a partial Java driver, so which actually avoids set of softwares to be installed in client machine compared to JDBC ODBC driver. Let me take this as Java application, as we know, and we know we have a JDBC driver on top of it. Make sure, guys, you should draw the diagrams in your interview so that the interviewer can understand better what you are going to explain. And that is the reason I'm drawing and I'm showing to you instead of showing the slides. So the JDBC API, you should import the JDBC jar to your project so that you can have all the classes available in your code. And we have a database. Let me take this for database. Now we have this native API driver. Unlike JDBC ODBC driver, this doesn't have multiple parts. You should install only one software. One is which is native API driver, and the other one which is database vendor library, which is common here also. So we have a native API library driver which is used to communicate between the database and the Java application. See, if you compare with the JDBC ODBC driver, then we avoided one layer, which is ODBC driver and JDBC native JDBC ODBC bridge driver. So we don't need to have a bridge driver, and again ODBC driver, there are two parts are there we should configure. But in terms of native library, native API driver, so we don't have two parts. We just need to configure only one thing. That is the reason it's called as the partially the Java driver. But here also the benefit will be that one, like the performance is actually compared to JDBC ODBC driver, it actually performs a bit better. So the performance wise, it is better than the JDBC ODBC bridge driver. That is only the benefit, and the client no need to configure more configurations like how we are doing in JDBC ODBC driver. The disadvantages, again, the client needs to install the vendor DB library, and so all these three he has to install in client machine. That is again the drawback. So anyhow, client will he can ready to install the application alone, but not all the softwares like vendor DB libraries and all. He don't want to install it. So that's about native API driver. So the disadvantages are almost similar to the JDBC ODBC driver, but the only difference is you don't need to configure one more layer of driver related configuration, but the drawback will be same, which is you should install all the software in client machine, and the performance wise it is little bit better than JDBC ODBC driver. Now we can see the other type of driver, which is network protocol driver. So here, let me modify this diagram for that. Now we are going to discuss about network protocol driver. So the network protocol driver also contains the Java application and the database layer. There's no difference between that, and but we here, if you see, there's no vendor DB driver is required. So we don't need this particular driver is required because the network protocol driver actually takes care of that. Let me rename this as so the network protocol library driver is actually avoids native like database vendor library. It actually have all the related data like for each database. So that is the reason we don't need a database related library. And in this case, we just need to have the client needs to install only the Java application and network protocol driver. But There is a disadvantage with this one, that's called as it needs a middleware. So the network protocol driver, it actually requires a middleware which actually used for communicating between the client machine and the database software. Middleware which actually requires to communicate between this client machine to database machine. So this middleware actually resides in server machine. So each database when you install, then this should be maintained within server side. And if you have the database also in the same place, then you can have the databases and middleware at the both ends. And this is how the architecture differs like. And the benefit will be like it actually performs better than the native API library, which is the second one. And the drawback will be again you have to install you need to maintain a middleware in between. That is the reason it actually makes the clients to be a client or developer to be perform more operations on it. So that's the reason this is not much recommended for development, and for clients also not much preferred on it. But comparatively, the other two drivers, which is JDBC ODBC driver and the native API driver, this is actually pretty fast, and the configuration is little bit. Let's go to the other type, which is thin driver. So thin driver is actually the most popular driver which actually used in real time, because this actually performs better than the other database drivers, JDBC drivers, which is the first ones like JDBC ODBC driver and native API driver and network protocol driver. Compared to all three drivers, this actually performs well. And here also the architecture looks same, but we can see what and all what will be the major benefit between the other drivers and JDBC driver. So we have a Java application, and we have JDBC API. So Java application will use JDBC API to make database connectivity with the classes. Now we have thin driver. So we know we have a database. So we have Java application. As we discussed, we must need a driver to communicate with database, which is thin driver we are using in this case, and these two will be installed in client machine. And we have a database. So in thin driver, so what is missing? The database library or a middleware compared to the other types. So do we require those things? No, we don't need anything. We just need a driver, then a database. If you remember the first diagram, so when I'm explaining a JDBC architecture, I just gave a driver, then a database. These are the thin driver actually working. It's not using any database related vendor libraries, it's not using any middlewares. so it's not using anything compared to the other types of drivers. So even the performance wise, if you see, this will be the pretty fast compared to the other three types of databases. That's a major difference between thin driver and the other drivers. And in the industry, all the people in real time, people are using this thin driver particularly because of the performance it is giving, and the client no need to configure much software configuration in his machine. And we also no need a middleware or database vendor library and all in this thin driver. So to consolidate, we have four types of driver. One is JDBC, ODBC driver. Second one will be native API driver. Third one will be network protocol driver. Fourth one will be thin driver. So these are all the four different types of driver we have. The disadvantages will be the first driver. So it is actually needs a database driver, JDBC, ODBC driver, and ODBC bridge we have, and then we need to have one more layer called as database vendor library. And native API driver is actually requires a database vendor library along with the driver software, and this is actually performs better than JDBC ODBC driver. But in case of network protocol driver, we don't need any database vendor library. This will actually performs better than this native API driver, means which is performs better than these two drivers. But this requires a middleware software which actually installed in the server machine. So that's the additional software we need. And compared to the coming to thin driver, it is actually performs better than all three other types of drivers. And the installation also, we don't need to have much installation and configuration. So we don't need any middlewares or any driver based database vendor libraries and all. We just need a driver is to be installed in a client machine and Java application. That's more than enough. And this will actually performs better than all three other types of database drivers. That is the reason in JDBC people are prefer to use thin driver as their JDBC driver in their real-time applications. So this is about the overall picture about database drivers. Next tutorial we can discuss about how to connect Java application to a database with the thin driver. So for giving explanation, for programmatic explanation for all three other types, we don't need, because it's not required, because we don't need to, we are not using in real time. So that is the reason I'm not considering these to be programming, and we don't need to waste our time on it, and we just need to have a knowledge of it, like this is how they actually looks, and that's how they are actually performing. And we can see the one which is actually thin driver, which is actually used for communicating with databases. The next tutorial we can start looking at how to connect with the thin driver to a database. Thanks guys, thanks for watching.